Once there was an age when thousands around the world flocked to Nickelodeon parlors, theaters, and picture palaces to witness what was to them a new miracle. For this was the time of the birth of the cinema, the motion picture, the very beginning of the first truly mass entertainment industry. Two things from the music halls and the vaudeville houses very early on in this century: their audiences and their comedians. It's astonishing to realize, how many of the immortal clowns of the films shared the bill with movies, which in their very earliest days were booked just as another act. In 1896, the Lumiere brothers' new invention, the cinematograph, was shown in London at the Empire Leicester Square, one of the finest music halls in Europe. The Lumiere cinematograph was brought to England by a friend of the two Lumiere brothers, a retired music hall performer called Truey, who no doubt rushed out of the theater on the day of his debut with moving pictures to take this film, in which the advertisement for the cinematograph appears on the theater canopy. Before long, every music hall program had to have its moving picture act. From each country, competing patented systems appeared in rival theaters, all claiming to be the latest improvement. Leopold Fregoli, an international star of the music halls from Italy, invented his own patent, Fregoliograph, and made his own films. This disconcerting film, made in 1897, shows part of his stage performance, which consisted of rapid changes of costume and character. He also did entire operas in which he would sing all the roles. Moving pictures fitted very easily into the halls, where the audience demanded anything that was entertaining and extraordinary. Poseur plastique, a dog who played the piano, contortionists, ventriloquists, or strongmen. This lady was one of the very first stars of music hall to go into the movies. Gilbert Cerrone, an American female impersonator, filmed by Edison in 1898. It didn't matter that film couldn't reproduce what was said. No one heard in the theater either for the laughter. The clowns of the music halls had to concentrate on visual comedy. Little Titch was one of the greatest artists of the British music hall.
I don't look as big a fool as I am.
He was diminutive, with a face like a wicked elf. It was his big boots dance that made him famous. No one could ever imitate him. Now, this film of Little Titch was made in France in the closing months of the last century. As one of the exhibits of the Great Exhibition, it was a pioneer attempt to make a sound film. The sound of the Big Boots dance was recorded and synchronized on a record. hat and his boots and his costume changes, little Titch was as popular in the music halls of Paris as he was in London. He was appearing in a review at the Folies Bergère in 1904, just at the time that Georges Méliès, the magician and pioneer filmmaker, made a film to be on the bill at the Follies. Entitled Paris to Monte Carlo in 2 hours, the film was such a success that it ran for over 300 performances. And one of the guest artists who made an appearance in it was little Titch himself. Clowns were international, like the motion pictures themselves. It was inevitable that the movies and the clowns should meet. These two unidentified but pugnacious clowns were filmed about 1906 in France. Perhaps it was the sun that brought the clowns and the cinema together. The European circuses used to spend the summer season among the vacation audiences of the Côte d'Azur. There you could find practically all the clowns of Italy and France. As it happened, the French film companies were looking for reliable sunlight. And so Pathé and Gaumont opened studios in the south of France entirely dedicated to the production of comedy. The seaside towns provided the locations, the circuses provided the artists. One of these circus stars was Servas, who was renamed for the cinema Arsène Lupin. Arsène Lupin was, of course, a parody of the celebrated fictional detective Arsène Lupin. Like the detective himself, he is a terrible know-all. But, of course, everything he does always goes wrong. In 1910, the Italian and French film industries competed to sign up the top clowns of the music halls and circuses. Ferdinando Guillaume belonged to one of the great Italian circus dynasties. Founded by an aristocratic refugee from the French Revolution who fled into Piedmont and started a new life as a traveling acrobat. No member of the Guillaume family, however, ever achieved the worldwide worldwide fame of Ferdinando, whose idiotic face and great grin were known and loved across the world in the years before the First World War. At first he was known as Tontolini. Later film comedians built themselves clearly defined characters. Little Tontolini, however, was a kind of abstraction of foolishness. He could assume every style or character, even that of a nice infant in a sailor suit playing truant to go to the carnival. At his best, in films like Tontolini and His Donkey, made in 1911, Tontolini soared to wonderful heights of surreal senselessness. Tontolini spent all his career in Italy. André Gide was a cosmopolitan. He was born in 1884, worked as a music hall singer and acrobat, and had occasionally appeared in films by Georges Méliès before Charles Passet hired him for his studios in 1906. As Boireau, he was soon famous throughout Europe. But in 1908, the Italian studios could offer bigger money than the French film producers. The Italians hired him, and in Italy, he now became Cretinetti. In the days when he worked for Georges Méliès, Gide learned a lot about the technique of film magic, which he put into practice in many of his films, like this one, How Cretinetti Pays His Debts, made in 1911. The genius of the great clowns was their ability to create their comedy out of the absurdities of real life. In the early years of the 20th century, most of Europe was gripped by a terrible fever, a passion for roller skating. This was a gift for the clowns, of course. And here is what Cretiniti made of the roller skating craze in Sport alla Moda, the fashionable sport of 1912. In later years, Deed returned to films in France, but his fame did not outlast the silent era. In the 1930s, he was working as a night watchman at the Pathé Studios, where once he had been king. In any case, by that time, a new clown had made his appearance to usurp all the older kings of comedy. Charlie Chaplin took all the old jokes of the music hall, the circus, the primitive years of the cinema, and made them look new and miraculous. Cretinetti had reduced the social fad of roller skating into a crazy farce. In the rink made in 1916, Chaplin elevated it into something like a poem, a virtuoso comic ballet. Just like the others, Chaplin had learned his craft and polished his techniques over the years on the stages of the music halls. Reared in poverty in Victorian London, he had followed his father and mother, quite naturally it seemed, onto the stage. Charles Chaplin Sr. was a popular comic singer of the 1890s. Falling victim to the occupational sickness of the old music halls, the bottle, he died while young Charlie was still a boy. Yet he had lived long enough to share the bill with the new star, called the Biograph here. But whatever the name, the same moving pictures whose fortunes were to be immortally linked with those of his son. Not that Charlie had any thought of moving pictures when he embarked from London in 1913 with the Fred Carno pantomime troupe, in which by this time he had become a star, for an American tour. In America, Mack Sennett heard there was a new comic star touring the vaudeville houses. Chaplin could hardly refuse the money offered by the Keystone Studios. By the new year of 1914, he was already at work on his second film, Kid Auto Races at Venice, an unrehearsed 5-minute comedy that was to be historic. Historic because it was the first time that the 25-year-old comedian from London tried out the costume that was to make him known and loved throughout the world. He'd made the costume out of bits and pieces borrowed from fellow actors at the Keystone Studios. Fatty Arbuckle's gigantic trousers, Ford Sterling's boots. It was a stroke of genius to add the mustache, the little swagger cane, the frayed wing collar, which hinted at ludicrous and pathetic aspirations to bourgeois respectability in the defiantly disreputable little tramp. Not only a new clown had arrived, but an immortal.
I firmly believe that